I think recording in progress. So without more ado, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our three speakers. So we're going to start with Sheena Dermanis, who's the Curriculum and Quality Manager and Designated Safeguarding Lead at ACH, and she leads on employment and training. Then Clare Hatton, who's the Director of Employment and Skills at West Midlands Combined Authority. And finally, Rob Sharples, who's a Senior Lecturer in Language and Education at the University of Bristol. So I will now hand over to Sheena. Sheena.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'll be talking about migration and education and touching on English as a leverage for integration and also empowering lives and helping the settlement of refugees and asylum seekers. So first of all, let's consider the area of optimising refugee resettlement in the UK. So I first of all wanted to allude to a three-year study that was made by academics of the University of Sussex, where they were looking at the progress of 280 refugees under the Gateway programme. They looked at refugees from Ethiopia, Iraq, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo as part of their research. And it's interesting that their findings showed that the current system is failing, and I do quote, through the inadequacies of the provision of English classes and also a lack of suitable routes to employment and training. So I chose this study because actually this study is 7 years ago, and where are we now? We're actually still in the same kind of situation. If you could change the slide, please. So what are the barriers to living a good life in the UK? So first of all, we see it on the news, we know about it. Asylum seekers being housed in hotels, not suitable, and other accommodation barges, whatever. It's really not great. Also, so the government agenda is not really supportive here. The Homes for the Ukraine scheme as well has not worked always. Some of the hosting accommodation has not been suitable for families. It's forced them into the host culture, if you like, which has not respected their development into the UK. Also, of course, many of asylum seekers do suffer from post-traumatic stress disorders. They've had terrible experiences in the past, come with mental health issues as part of their journey over here, or what's happened to them back home. So that is a huge barrier, and to have that sickness when they come over. Language barrier, we've touched on it already. It's going to be a recurrent theme throughout my presentation. It's not really allowing for the skill sets that they've achieved back home to be recognised in this country, and as a result they cannot access medium salaries and pathways that they should. That is a difficulty. And also when people come over, there's a lack of cultural orientation within the community, and that can make the community a very hostile place and very isolating. And also when people get into work or want to get into work, the cultural awareness of the differences that the UK presents in the workplace is something that is not always touched on and can be a barrier to refugees when they come over. Community, again, absolutely limited social interaction, that feeling of isolation as a result of a language barrier, as a result of not being welcomed into the community or having that understanding of the community. Research really does show that the social networks within and between communities can really transitionally they can really affect the well-being of refugees. So what else? Lack of basic training opportunities, lack of volunteering opportunities, those increased barriers of getting into work, the lack of access of people who really understand where they're coming from in the community, this idea of community champions, somebody who's got lived experience, who can really identify and support, is such a powerful concept, but it's one that is not used as often as it should, in my opinion. And as a result, that feeling of segregation, doesn't matter how long people are here, sometimes it's ongoing over time, and that's really sad. It's interesting to see that women from this optimising refugee resettlement in the UK, women along with teenagers who've missed core education, sometimes because of turmoil in the home country or cultural reasons, they are often the ones who have, from this research, faced the biggest barriers to integration. And it's something that challenges us in ACH, is often reaching the females in the community, getting them in to work with us. We have worked on ways forward with that, such as creating social groups, doing needlework together and so on, but it does remain an area that we do want to develop further. Next slide, please. So now let's have a look at English then. I alluded to it in the first slide, and it's been mentioned a couple of times already. So there is a real access to anybody who's newly arrived to that flexible learning. Colleges start their new year in September. They onboard in September. They may onboard in January as well. But basically, that is that. So what happens to people? If they get into college, it's often more like an exam factory. You'll do entry 1 this year, you'll do entry 2 next year. The colleges themselves have financial targets and success targets to meet, and they're often driven in that way. And it's not fit for purpose for people who want to integrate and lead the life they want in a much quicker time frame. We also have to consider the structure of our English language. If the newly arrived person has another language that's not Romance or from the Germanic family of language, the structure, the alphabet are very different, and that can be very can add a different an added barrier and time frame to getting into the English. Our English language as well, it's got grammar, the rules that are there to be broken all the time. There's always exception to grammar rules, a huge range of strange idioms, and pronunciation of certain spellings. There's 3 words that I've got there, which are reflecting on Middle English Chaucer type language. We've got dough, tough, and bow. It's all pronounced in a different way, but all with the same spelling. That is tough. It's a tough language to learn, but it's not an impossible language, of course. So just alluding to a quote here, the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford stated that non-native English speakers learn language at different paces depending on multiple factors, such as their learning abilities, the age at which they migrated, or their exposure to English before and after moving to the UK. And you do find as well, obviously, that anybody who has had teaching of English back home, when they come, they are at a slightly higher advantage to support their integration. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what has ACH been doing to try and deal with these things, these matters that we know are adding barriers to integration, supporting people into achieving what they want and fulfilling and leading a fulfilled life? We were very lucky to be invited by the Home Office, who commissioned research through the Policy Lab to be part of this process. And the question that was being addressed by the Home Office is, how can we ensure that refugees can participate in language learning that supports their integration, which was a fascinating process to be part of. So the research took place on different sites, London, Coventry, Yorkshire and Devon. And we were very lucky to be part of this from our work in Coventry, where one of our refugees was filmed and talked about their experiences, their lived experiences back home, and how that compares to what they have encountered since they've been in the UK, and looking at their journey with them. It also involved providers. I was part of this in my role as curriculum and quality manager. The tutor from Coventry was also involved. A local authority lead was also involved in being interviewed, and across all sites that contributed to the research. Next slide, please. So what were the findings? Well, ESOL supervision, provision is too supply driven. And there is a culture of change required. Everything that I've raised previously was considered here. One of the solutions would be, for example, to have that flexibility of language opportunity and community cohesion with the establishment of language hubs, where people can go socialize and also work on their language skills. And to have more courses, I'm thinking of pure illiteracies, more courses where you've got the language embedded in with a sector focus. So your skill learning and your language learning, language for purpose together, to avoid those relentless years of what seems like learning English forever, which sadly so many people encounter. Next slide, please. And further on to this as well, we wanted to take take as many barriers and remove them as far as possible. So we're considering in ACH, what does ESOL actually mean to people? I mean, literally, it's English for speakers of other languages, but what is this thing? So we did a comparison with functional skills English delivery, which is also offered to native English speakers, because we understood as well that a lot of people end up doing ESOL courses and then they progress on to functional skills. But if you look at what's highlighted on this slide, it does show that there are actually minimal differences between the two qualifications. Just slightly that the ESOL writing exam is slightly more grammatically driven with regards to the way it's marked for accuracy. Although with the reform of functional skills, the grammatical element is also quite severe. And with the speaking and listening, there's also a listening component. So one additional element to that ESOL, so very little difference. And if somebody does functional skills as a course, then it's recognised by the English employers. And as I say, it's all about breaking down barriers, giving the same diet, but also getting something that doesn't look different on a CV, if you like, that doesn't already cause somebody to feel that they are not, that they need to do more maybe to match an English-speaking native. And what are our vision? What is our vision? Himelo, the training arm of ACH under which I'm working. So we really want to ensure that language development that we deliver is fit for purpose, and that we are educating the complete learner. So we're not giving a one-size-fits-all approach to language learning at all. We're listening to what the client wants and what they need, and then we are shoehorning our language development to support them. So we've also got employability at the heart of what we're doing, and integration as well, so that language is again fit for purpose, that we design the curriculum to make sure that it is the types of language fit what is needed for different units. Vocationally as well, if we are working, for example, with the hospitality sector, we're ensuring that clients have the relevant vocabulary and language skill to be able to operate at a good level in that kind of environment. And we do embed language into to other subjects. It's embedded throughout everything we do. We also consider the culture of the workplace, because we know it's not all about language development. Of course, it's about integration, it's about understanding, and we've done some work on the culture of the workplace, both for clients and also for employers as well, so they can understand some of the difficulties that somebody might encounter coming into their workplace and potential adaptations that might need to be done to make sure that it's as welcoming as possible. And also to make sure that clients really are aware of precarious employment and their rights, because knowledge is power. And if people do not know, one country is different to another, they need to know what is allowed here in the UK. We don't want people to be exploited. We want to avoid that and protect them. So this is a really important element of training that we have also been working on. So we definitely need to continue to ensure that integration and language development go hand in hand and have that personalised approach, not this year on, year out development which gets people nowhere. I've used here a Persian proverb to finish on: a new language is a new life, because absolutely they go hand in hand, and we're all about creating new lives and supporting people to realise their dreams, and language is obviously a big part of the vehicle in that process. Thank you. I've asked for questions, but I don't know, Bridget, it might not be appropriate now. I don't know whether that comes at the end.
Yeah, we'll do that at the end, I think, Sheena. So thanks very much for that. I thought I was particularly interested in your comparison between ESOL and functional English with functional skills. I thought that was really fascinating. So thanks for that. I'll now pass on to Claire.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Apologies, couldn't get myself off mute quickly enough. And apologies to listeners if there's a little bit of background noise. I'm at the Labour Party conference, hidden over in a corner to be able to do this today. But first reflection, there's not much in what Sheena said that I don't recognise, but I suppose what I would say positively is that it's not the universal picture in the West Midlands. I think we have moved on from some of that, and whilst I recognise a lot of that, I'm not saying it's fixed. What I wanted to do today was to talk to you a little bit about the West Midlands, what we've done so far, what we still see as the issues, and where next for us as well, and much of it, as I say, is in the context of what Sheena's talked about. So West Midlands, hugely ethnically diverse, well over 100 languages spoken every day in our communities, numbers of migrants moving in, influxing into our area, increasing the sort of complexity of the political discourse and social challenges that are already present in our labour markets in the region. But I think it's incumbent on us to be able to look at that and work differently. And I know we're talking about ESOL, but sometimes too much of the discourse around how we support migrants and refugees is just about ESOL. And I think we need to move that narrative on as well, as a group of regional partners in how we do that. And whilst it's a really essential part of that, Sheena's already alluded to a lot of the other factors and things that are needed as part of a comprehensive training program. So I guess our one overriding ambition is to talk less about ESOL, to talk more about language acquisition and integration in the West Midlands. So you won't hear us talking about ESOL as much in our skills policy moving forward. We will be talking about language acquisition, integration and inclusive growth much more when we talk about this. So a bit of a reframing from us, I think, and that's probably something as a reflection over our last few years of working in this space of managing a skills budget for the region. So when we think about our refugees and our migrants in our region, it's actually quite a small number, smaller than you might think. So just over 4,000 people settled in Birmingham. I thought it was going to be more. Just over 2,000 in Coventry, and those are our two biggest cities. So yeah, quite interesting really, in terms of our population, and probably why we don't think in the way we need to at community level enough. But in terms of what we've been doing so far with our funding, we have responsibility for the adult education budget. So many of you know it is a one of the only annual recurring sources of funding. We get 130 million a year. We spend 15 million of that on ESOL training. So it was 13 million before we took control of the budget, up to 15 million. I could probably spend the whole 130 million on ESOL training and basic skills training. The demand is such in the region, but obviously that budget has to span the range of things we do. So usually around about 12,000 residents go through ESOL courses funded by us in a year. But I guess our big reflection, and the one thing we want to address, is far too few of those receive any other training alongside ESOL. They just do ESOL, and sometimes, as Sheena described, on an endless cycle, taking years and years. Not always, but that is too often the case. And far too few are progressing into employment or into further learning. And far too much of our ESOL ends at entry 3. And to Sheena's point about functional skills, I just think that's a funding fudge rather than a pedagogical decision, if I am really honest. In too many cases, people move people from ESOL onto functional skills to keep them in that cycle, rather than it being solely a pedagogical thing. I might be being unfair, but I suspect that's a big part of it. So things that we've done. We have opened up new models of delivery. We have looked at blended online and in-person delivery. We have ESOL delivery happening out of Job Centre Plus now, with pop-up ESOL hubs to get people introduced to language. We funded Innovation Hub for ESOL learning in Birmingham, looking at to develop the pedagogy, to develop the initial assessment, to look at how we do that more coherently across the region. And we have introduced vocational ESOL. Maybe not to the extent we would like, but we've started to see quite an adoption now across all of our colleges, and they all have a target now. Any college that delivers ESOL for us has to deliver a minimum of 20% vocational ESOL. So far, we've seen that most successfully in construction and care, but there are other areas we need to really develop that in. Sheena talked about hospitality. That will be a next area for us. But again, some green shoots, I think, in terms of the development of the pedagogy and the provision. And I've already mentioned we have slightly increased levels of investment, and we increased our funding rates by 10% as well. Probably still not enough, but hopefully it goes some way. And I think above all else, what we've tried to do is to be flexible and to be open and to think about what we're doing. And we're still very much on that journey in the region. And if you can move to my second slide, please. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we think we want to do next. I've already said, I think much of our work now has to be talked about in terms of language acquisition, in terms of, labour market outcomes, in terms of integration. So a reframing of how we do that, but we recognise that we don't hold all the cards. There are lots of different funding streams for migration support and for English language training for migrants and refugees, and it can often be piecemeal. So big part of our work will be been trying to bring some coherence to that in a regional framework wherever the training and support is funded. So we get a better grip of that, and we make sure we're offering a better service. So we will continue with the drive on lots of things we're doing, but the other thing we want to do over the coming 12 months is work much more intentionally with providers in a different way. So we're looking at new distinct pilots aimed at specifically at supporting refugees, which encompasses lots of the things Sheena's talked about: saturation models, multidisciplinary approaches to language acquisition, development of technical and transferable skills, much more connection to workplace, to what goes on in the labour market as well, and really interested in how we start to develop culturally informed outreach in our region, so that we can really start to get to and work with and support underemployed members of linguistic communities and who share cultural principles. so that they can navigate the workplace. So we don't always have to do something for Romanians or something for Ukrainians or something. So again, just trying to evolve our thinking and our approach to do something a little bit different. I guess we don't do this alone. We just convene some of this, and albeit we fund some of it. We really need to continue our partnership working hard with organisations like ACH, so that we can bring our providers and our employers to the table, and we can work differently and change that narrative. And we've got more work to do with government. We're not sure that the qualifications are totally fit for purpose. We think the pedagogy is probably underdeveloped nationally, not, you know, looking at the sort of Ofsted regime. How does it assess language learning? How does it assess the outcomes of that? And again, wanting to be quite open to talk and work with the sector about how we evolve our approach over the next few years. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour from me about what's happening in the West Midlands, what we've done, and where we see things progressing. So hopefully that's been useful.
Thanks, Claire. That's really, really impressive. And yeah, it's really inspiring and exciting to know. I don't know, sometimes we just hear about so much bad stuff. So it's really great to hear about what you're doing. I'll now hand over to Rob.
Hi there. Thank you. Well, what a pair of acts to follow. I'm going to be talking, if we could move to the next slide, about some actual research data that we've brought together. So we'll be drawing on a number of recent reports that we've produced, and there's a QR code which I'll show again at the end for people who want to sign up to our, you know, merry band of people who are staying involved. You could call it an email list, but I think it's more of a calling, or even a community. We launched this project a few weeks ago. We've been working on it over the past 6 months, called the Bristol Plan for Migrant Learners. It has a fairly grandiose title because we wanted the university and the city to take a stake in it, and we're very, very pleased that they have. We are approaching all of this from the perspective of language in schools particularly. So where we use ESOL for adults, of course, we're speaking about EAL, or English as an Additional Language, for learners in schools. And it really speaks to something that Sheena mentioned, that one of the major groups at risk are children and young people who have missed a chunk of that core schooling. We've got a very large number of young people arriving in all our major cities. We don't really have a good policy response. We don't have an integrated policy response. We don't really know what to do with them in schools. And that means that crucial window of opportunity that could really turn these young people's life courses in one direction or another is being missed. They then end up, you know, leaving formal education at 16, maybe coming into a 16+ ESOL program, but most likely having a gap of a couple of years, and then they come in with the kind of the main group of adult ESOL learners that we've heard about so far. So we think there's something really important about those years of upper secondary where we could make a difference. So we wanted to move beyond what's actually happening in schools, because what's happening in schools is so influenced by what's happening outside. And we interviewed through a Delphi survey and a series of one-to-one interviews. We interviewed teachers, social workers, immigration solicitors, psychologists, policymakers, and so on. And what we found, well, we're going to show more detail of what we found. What we found is a system that is obviously creaking under the strain of budget cuts, but also a system that could move quite rapidly with the right policy approaches and incentives. I want to talk you through some of those findings particularly. The next slide is a quote that I love. It's one that has come up in different forms in different places. This particular expression is about 5 years old, but really points to the fact that we don't know enough about the children in our schools to be able to make good evidence-based policy at the moment. We take this group, EAL, and Claire mentioned working with, you know, Romanian or Polish, which are kind of national stroke language groups. But in schools, we just talk about, are they English-speaking children or not? And in the data, there's slight refinement. Do we believe they're English speakers, or do we believe they're speaks further languages, or do we just not know? That's not good enough. That doesn't tell the difference between the children of two professors who have migrated to Bristol, working their third language with very, very strong educational histories, the children of Somali families in our city who have been here for generations but have been excluded from educational opportunity for many, many years, the children of children who have just arrived unaccompanied from Afghanistan or from Eritrea, and who are in care and estate. All of that gets lumped together in this EAL category. We don't distinguish young refugees, we don't distinguish young migrants. And of course, outcomes are hugely varied. And that means that you can look at your national data and you can normally cut it one way or the other. Government's quite good at this, and say, these children are performing at average. Some of them are doing really, really well in education. Some of them are being really, really badly failed. That statement that migrant children, they want to do well, they work hard in school, their parents really value education, things like this we hear a lot, hide such a range of outcomes that they are, in the words of this one influential report, really profoundly misleading. We want to get into the details of that. The next slide shows a little bit more what it's like from the perspective of their teachers. So this is a quote from one of our participants in the most recent study. We did some preparatory interviews. I'm the only EL practitioner in the school. That's the only person who has any kind of professional knowledge about how language is learned in the curriculum. And one of the distinguishing features of EAL, of course, is that it's all about getting access to the curriculum. You could think of the distinction, if you wanted, that EAL is about language for learning and ESOL is about language for living. Of course, at this age, they really overlap as young people take their first steps out into the world. Anyway, the only person who's meant to have any knowledge of how languages develop in the curriculum works 18 hours a week, and there's never enough time or resources to feel like I'm supporting the students or the teachers adequately. When I first heard her say that, I actually thought I misheard, and she said 18 hours a day, and it would still hold true. The problem here is clearly systematic or systemic. The problem is that if you are the only person with any knowledge about how language works, when 1 in 5, 1/5 of pupils in our schools are bilingual, the school cannot possibly serve that children's needs. So you could have a very high-performing EL specialist. It's completely the wrong approach until subject language becomes part of subject teaching, where it's something that schools do routinely. Then we're always going to be fighting a rearguard action. So on the next slide, we tried to clarify that as a series of broad problems. And we could make this list very, very long, and I'll become more optimistic shortly, I promise. There is a real lack of clarity over what good EL provision should involve. And I think that resonates very strongly for me with what Claire said about new models of provision. There's lots of opportunities for new models of provision in schools, but actually the way that schools deliver education, the way that teachers teach, the way that schools are structured is pretty consistent across subject groups. So where you have opportunities for innovation in EL provision compared with in adult education, it's about moving all of the school's approach with it, deepening that connection with the community, building connections with outside providers or with employers and so on. We also don't know what good practice looks like. So we know that when children achieve a high level of proficiency, they're likely to outperform monolingual children. But that's a big if. We have a good sense, and it speaks to what Sheena said about whether English is particularly hard to learn. We know that age on arrival and length of residence, two key benchmarks in language acquisition research, are significant. But what's really important is not how long you've been exposed to English, it's the quality of that exposure. So we don't have benchmarks, for example, around what looks like high quality interaction in the classroom, rich language exposure, and so on. And because Ofsted doesn't inspect on this, because it's not part of teacher training, actually for school leaders and for system leaders like the heads of multi-academy trusts or local educational authorities, there's no management information. So the system essentially has a big gap around this, and over the last 10 years we've lost that expertise in large part from the wider teaching workforce. So the problem really with language and education in schools is this big void. We just don't really know what's going on. Individual people are very good, but at a system level, we don't really know how it should be working or when it is working. And although we know it's highly dependent on what happens outside schools, we don't know what those interactions look like. So on the next slide, I've put a little about how we approached it. So in this particular study, this BPML, we call it, Plan for Migrant Learners, we wanted to look at how we could get a city level, really effective approach to supporting young migrants. That means from the first moment that someone in any of the services that are involved in young people get the first message that this young person is going to arrive in the city or has arrived in the city, what's the workflow? What's the process that leads to really effective outcomes? The work we're doing now is digging into a lot of the problems that get in the way of that. Our findings have shown us, I think, some really powerful directions. So an overview of the project. We used a Delphi consensus study. That's a multi-round questionnaire where between rounds you refine the answers and send it back out to the same people. And each time you're looking for consensus. What do people agree is a problem? What do people agree is a solution? And you might not get very many points of consensus. We found 3 main ones. But where this very, very diverse group of people do agree, we know it's something we can strongly base policy on or develop policy on, because you have that broad and deep consensus that this is something that affects us all. Okay, I see a question about how trauma affects it. Yeah, we worked with trauma specialists in the...
Sorry to interrupt, Rob. Can you
we'll
take the
questions later?
questions
Yeah, of course,
afterwards?
absolutely.
Yeah.
But yes is the answer. Okay, so I'll take you on 2 slides and then we can dig into details if we have time. But what did we learn? So there are 3 main areas of consensus. Now, this first one, partly I think was fairly intuitive, partly was really surprising, and I'm not sure what I think about it, if I'm honest. Whether you were a psychologist, whether you were a specialist nurse, whether you were a teacher, whether you're an immigration solicitor, a foster carer, a social worker, a local policymaker, the number one challenge facing you in your work was the fact that children don't have secure accommodation. You can't teach children who are being moved every 28 days. The disruption is too great. You can't support children if they're moving in and out of your patch as a social worker. You can't treat PTSD effectively if there's that ongoing instability. So accommodation was the number one problem that had 100% consensus across all the people that we worked with in this study. That tells us something hopeful and despairing. And maybe Claire, particularly Sheena, could speak to this later. Accommodation is in large part affected by local factors, the availability of accommodation, but also by national policy regimes. So there's areas that we can affect and areas that we have very little traction over. But I think it's something that we know will make a significant difference to young people, and the evidence suggests we should prioritize it. The other 2 go together. We found that participants from whatever discipline found it very, very hard to prioritize different services or different areas of need or different strategies. And at first we thought, well, this is hopeless, right? We're not getting any consensus. We get too much consensus. Everyone says everything is important. What we realized as we dug deeper into the data is that we are looking at a system level approach. And that is to say, you can't fix education by working only in schools. You can't fix healthcare by working only in the healthcare service. It's moving that along together is likely to be the most powerful route to change. You can't have any breakout successes, or at least not that far. And that's interesting because our professional disciplines, are based around the services we work for. Teachers don't know how to make healthcare better. They know how to make teaching better. They're constrained by things that they're not that familiar with, for example. What really struck me as well, if we have a moment, we'll dig into a little more of the findings, but it was so clear that however fragmented the system was, and we asked people, when you try and get help from other services, can you get it? No. Can you find the people you need to speak to? No. Will people respond? Will they act when you need them to? No. It was unremittingly negative. But very, very clearly, people said the one thing we want is opportunities to work together. And the collegiality that came through that study was really striking in the face of the challenges that they had. Laura, I don't know if you maybe think it's on a presenter view, but yeah, we keep dipping in and out at the moment. So the further findings there is that actually areas that got strong consensus were the need for further communication between services, more than extra funding, more than, if we go back, sorry, more than anything else, it was that need for communication between services and training. Not subject-specific training, as it were, professional training. People know how to do their jobs, but they want opportunities to understand what each other are doing. It's a really striking message that people faced with a system that worked against them, they felt again and again and again, really wanted opportunities to know what each other were doing and to work more as an interprofessional community. More tentatively, we found a very interesting roles we called specialists, generalists, and connectors. So an immigration solicitor might be an example of a specialist. They know the law, that's their job. They don't know much about education, they don't need to. Generalists, often people outside roles like that. Foster carers often saw themselves as generalists. They need to know more about how the system works to guide people. People who work for charities often saw themselves as generalists. But it wasn't so clear-cut. Some of our specialists actually said, my job, yes, I'm an immigration solicitor, but I've also got to show them how the system works and so on. So those two roles were really interesting, but it was the connectors that really struck me. There was a number of people, often volunteers, community ESOL tutors would be good examples, foster carers and so on, who didn't have what we might call a professional role as in a professional identity there, but who saw their job as to make that system work. So we have people, they tend to be excluded from things like interagency meetings, but who are holding that system together and aren't recognised. So we're going to follow up on that to learn more. Now, I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I think I've probably run over my 10 minutes. There's kind of further findings I've put on slides, but if we wanted to skip ahead, I'll leave it in the hands of our slide controller.
I'll give you a couple more minutes, Rob.
Well, let's skip ahead to the slide with a quote at the end, because we can pick up all of this in questions. I have no sort of, that stress stream of giving a talk nude in front of people. That one doesn't worry me. It's the turning up with not enough to talk about that is my stress stream. So if we go back a couple, just that quote there, because I think it's really the one after that.
There's one, the one before, the one after.
After, that's it.
Yeah.
It's okay. So when it's been incorporated, we've sort of lost the text there. I'll just read it out to you. It's a quote from Dewey, 105 or 6 years ago now. He says, in a complicated and perverse world, and I think we can all agree we live in a complicated and perverse world, action which is not informed with vision, imagination, and reflection is more likely to increase conflict than to straighten things out. And that's become a bit of a watchword for us on our research team. We heard from Sheena, I feel, what a complicated and perverse world it is. We heard from both about that idea of vision, imagination, and reflection. One of the things that I really worry about is that we drive forward and we drive investment and we drive action along what I would call fairly disciplinary lines. And that leads us to incremental improvement. What's come across really clearly from this work is that actually, however bad things are, it is only bringing people together from different professional backgrounds, finding ways through the tangle that are going to make a difference. And I'll finish with a couple of examples of that. We have in this study, we had an immigration solicitor telling us that she most often meets young people at the appeal stage of their asylum claim. That means she's scrabbling to try and get the information together, to get the paperwork, to be able to represent them effectively, trying to overturn a settled decision in appeal, rather than meeting them when she needed to, which is when they first made their application for asylum. The reason she thinks that is because the social workers aren't sending her the referral early enough. You talk to the social workers, the reason is the Home Office aren't sending the paperwork through early enough. This seems to me to be the most resolvable problem we've got, is that, do you know what? We could just represent these children. We could just refer them before the paperwork comes through. The occasional 1 in 100 won't get the legal aid, but you lose far more money than that in the Scrabble. A framework agreement for immigration advice seems like an absolute no-brainer, but requires bringing new combinations of people together to thrash out exactly how it would work. Another example is discussions between the West England Combined Authority, WECA, who hold the adult education budget in our region, and the local colleges. WECA, and I'm sure Claire is the same for you and your authority, are absolutely desperate to fund children on innovative courses to make sure they don't drop out the system at 16 and not come back in at 18. But it's very difficult because the colleges aren't quite sure how to present these combined courses in their funding bids. So you have adult courses on ESOL, you have courses for children. That gap of 16 to 18 is missing. It's very, very difficult to fudge that in the way it needs to, so everyone can communicate exactly what's needed. But one of the projects we're doing now is bringing around that group of people around a table to say, right, well, you've separately told us, but don't feel able to tell each other that this is a real priority for you. You're not sure how to drive it forward. It doesn't quite fit with most of the funding streams that you need. We're going to need new types of courses. We're going to need to fund them in a different way. Big picture is we all want it to work. Day-to-day picture is actually we can't quite work out how. You can see time after time you've got tangles like this that seems to be having an outsized effect on the lives of young migrants at this crucial time as they come towards the end of their childhood into the adult world. And we know, as Sheena said, we lose them. These kids are dropping out the system and they're not really coming back. So that's, I think, the big picture of what we've been trying to work on. And it is about that slow, careful working of groups of people. And we'll be building on that in a couple of projects to come. I think I'm way over my time, so I shall stop and hand us over back to questions.
Great, thanks, Rob. And I think that's a great way to end, because this is part also this kind of idea of connecting people up and having kind of conversations across different people working in different capacities is really part of the point of this seminar series.